studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, JP D'Arbragosian. It's Thursday. And on Thursdays, it's our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episodes, where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and our allies community. Today, our guest is Dr. Kade Goepferd. Dr. Goepferd is the Chief Education Officer and Medical Director of the Gender Health Program at Children's Minnesota. So we're going to be talking about trans healthcare today, but I want to say off the top, obviously there was the executive order that happened with the new administration on Monday. I know we've covered that a little bit earlier in the week. There are going to be other folks who are going to reference to you that'll talk more about the legal challenges and whatnot, and we'll get into that into future episodes. I highly recommend Ellie Krug's episode this Saturday afternoon of The Illegal Trans Woman. We're going to be talking about today what is trans healthcare, particularly for youth. We have a national, global expert, I would say, on that topic. And so I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Goepferd to The Gailey Show. Hello.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I thought that we could start maybe with a lightning round of questions to deal with the lies and misinformation that are out there by a certain segment of the population. So would you mind participating in this lightning round of questions to help us better understand this? Okay.
Nothing better than a good lightning round.
All right. Question number one. Are millions of children suddenly trans, and are they undergoing gender affirmation?
No.
Okay. Number two question. Are kids receiving puberty blockers at schools and coming home a different gender?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Number three. Can kids just walk into any medical clinic without their parents and medically transition?
Nope.
Okay. Are all trans kids getting surgeries?
No, not at all.
Okay. And then number five, or are we number six now? Are all of these medications experimental and dangerous?
No, not in the least.
Okay. That's about as much time as I want to spend on the lines. No, I think this is important because we saw all of this in the campaign last year. I imagine we're going to still be doing this moving forward. What we want to do on the show, though, is just get those out of the way. So for folks, go back and re-listen to that segment because you heard it here first from the national global expert on LGBTQ trans healthcare for youth. None of that is happening. We are thinking more clearly about this issue. But Dr. Goepferd, tell us a little bit more about your role, because you have an amazing title at Children's Minnesota, Director of Chief Education Officer, rather, and Medical Director of the Gender Health Program. Walk us through what that means.
Yeah. So, basically, I'm a pediatrician. So I've been a pediatrician with Children's Minnesota for about 20 years, and I've always had a deep interest in education and training both the next generation of healthcare providers as well as current clinicians who are out in practice and making sure they get up-to-date information. And so that's where I've kind of moved myself into a leadership space in education at Children's. And then clinically, my background is in primary care, seeing kids in clinic. And I've always had an interest and expertise in working with LGBTQ youth. And over time, began to see that it was really transgender and gender diverse young people who were having a hard time accessing the healthcare and support and just getting resources and information that both they needed and their families needed. And so with the help and support of Children's Minnesota in 2019, we launched the Gender Health Program at Children's Minnesota, which is a specialized healthcare and mental health care program for transgender and gender diverse young people. So those primarily under the age of 18.
And we are so lucky to have that here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. But it's also you have folks from outside of the state that come here and receive healthcare services, right?
Yeah, we absolutely care for kids and families in Minnesota, but increasingly with the anti-trans legislation that's been put in place over the last few years across the country, Minnesota, as a trans refuge state, sort of sits as an island surrounded by states where access to this, life-saving and essential healthcare has been banned. So we're seeing many families crossing the border to try to get healthcare, but also just moving their families here. So we see a lot of transplants who have moved from all over the country to Minnesota because they know it's a good place to raise kids, and they know it's a place where all kids belong, including transgender and gender diverse kids.
I want to revisit the numbers question because there was a study that recently came out, excuse me, about this idea of how many youth are actually experiencing gender dysphoria and are
Hmm.
getting gender affirmation. Can you walk us through what that number actually is?
Yeah. I think there's some it's good to differentiate between gender identity and identity exploration in young people and actual receiving of medical treatment. So, what is definitely true is that, for example, when we survey young people in the state of Minnesota and ask them about their identities and who they're wanting to be in relationships with, do they identify as male or female or something in between or on the transgender spectrum? We are seeing increasing numbers of young people who are identifying themselves as LGBTQ and as transgender or gender diverse in some way. And this really represents an expansion of language, an expansion of concepts of identity. But that's being sort of misconstrued and mistaken for actual numbers of young people seeking medical care. So the study that you're referencing was a survey of over 5 million kids with private health insurance. And what they found was that less than 0.1% of them were receiving any type of medication, including puberty suppression and or hormones. So while, if you're a parent, in anywhere and you are hearing young people sort of exploring identities and pronouns, just know that the actual number of young people who are going to a clinic and then actually following through on getting medication is quite small.
There's this talking point slash lie that suddenly all the kids are
Mhm.
are becoming quote unquote or choosing it. Uh, Walk me then through a little bit more the that distinction that you're making there between folks who are going to engage in gender affirmation and the exploration of identity.
Yeah, I mean, as a pediatrician, I work with kids from, the time they're infants and toddlers all the way up through adolescence. And along the way, kids are learning about themselves all along. And what we know about gender identity is that kids as young as 3 and 4 years old can be very clear that their identity, how they see themselves, is different than the sex they were assigned at birth or what people guessed for them based on their bodies or their anatomy. That can be pretty clear to us, that distinction, when kids very young are really clear about who they are, even if they're not affirmed. I think what becomes a little stickier for us is when we move into that sort of later adolescence, middle school, kind of that time when kids are just finding themselves all over the place. I mean, they're figuring out who they are, what their values are, what's important to them, and they're going through puberty, which is just, kind of a train wreck for everybody, hormone wise. And so they're doing that now in an environment where we just have new language. We have, when I was a kid, no one even talked to me about gender identity. I didn't know what transgender was. I don't think the word non-binary, which is how I identify, I don't even think that word existed when I was growing up, certainly, in college and in my early 20s. So our language has evolved. And so these sort of ways that human beings have always existed throughout time as people who are on a spectrum of gender identity now have words and names, and we're getting more used to using different pronouns. And so young people are finding themselves within that spectrum and asking to be seen for who they are. And I think that's certainly one thing. And it's even that is not all adolescence. Sometimes when something feels new or foreign to us, we tend to over overestimate how many that is. It's like when, when you're pregnant or someone who's pregnant, then you see all the pregnant people. It's like if your young person is transgender or someone that is transgender, then suddenly everything you hear is about transgender people, but that's just because your lens or your focus has changed. So even those who are identifying as transgender is still a relatively small percentage, maybe 1 to 3%. But then of those who actually feel enough distress or discomfort that they are seeking medical intervention is even a much smaller number than that.
Walk me through the language part of that because the language is new, but it's
Mhm.
not because it's a new phenomenon. It's
Right.
more that, like in the 30s, 20s, actually, before the Nazis came over in Germany, Berlin was a huge area of medical research and also just queer expression. all of that medical research was lost when the Nazis came in. They burned all of it. They shut down all the research centers, right? So we're not talking about it's a new phenomenon, more that we're actually allowed, like the medical and the researchers are finally letting us do this research and explore this treatment, right? That it's not something that's a new thing, but it's that we're finally being able to do that research and to do that care, right?
Yeah, I mean, transgender people have existed throughout history in all countries across the world. Many other cultures other than here in the United States have different language and different identities to describe people who are transgender. So the phenomenon of being transgender has existed as long as humanity has existed. What is different now in the last maybe 10 to 15 years is that here, kind of in the United States or in sort of more Western sort of countries, we have expanded language. So I like to, because I'm a pediatrician, I really like simple analogies. So for example, if you gave a kid a box of 64 crayons and asked them when they're 4 to pull out the blue crayon, they'd probably identify 10 to 12 blue crayons in that box and pull them all out and hand them to you, because to them they're all blue. That's what they know. They know blue, they know red, they know yellow, they know green, kind of primary colors. If you hand that same box to a kid who's 12 or 13 and say, get me the blue crayon, they will probably look back at you and say, which blue crayon? Do you mean light blue? Do you mean midnight blue? Do you mean periwinkle? And those colors were always in the box. I mean, the 5-year-old saw them, just didn't have names for them. But the 12 or 13-year-old now has names for them. And that's kind of the world we're in now. We now have these names, non-binary, gender diverse, gender expansive, demi boy, all of these other words to describe identities and people who have always been there, just without description. And so that's kind of the beauty of the time we're living in, is more descriptive language, but then it can also seem new or different or unfamiliar for people who are not a part of that community and for whom those identities have largely been invisible.
That is an amazing analogy. I love that. You need to copyright that, sell the royalties to it. It is on point. We are talking with Dr. Kade Goepferd from Children's Minnesota. I want to talk more about the history of the care and how it's come to be after this short break. More with Dr. Goepferd after this messages from our sponsors. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Gailey Show. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm your host, JP D'Arbagossian. It is Thursday, which is our time of the week for Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly. My guest is Dr. Kade Goepferd. They received a Special Recognition Award for Excellence in LGBTQ Youth and Education from the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2019. Their first TEDx talk, The Revolutionary Truth About Kids and Gender Identity, was released in October 2020. I can't think of anyone else that I'd want to talk to more about healthcare for trans kids. And walk me through then the history, if you will, of the development of this care, right? This is not something that just happened 5 years ago where we just suddenly came up with all of these, tools and resources to give to children. So kind of walk me through what that has looked like, the evolution of that in the medical industry.
Yeah. So, transgender healthcare has been around for a very long time. Earlier in the segment, you referenced kind of Berlin and the destroying of documents. And so transgender individuals and them seeking healthcare has been, with us for many, many years, decades. The first standards of care, international standards of care, were developed in the 70s, and we're now on our 8th iteration of those standards, which are revised roughly every, 8-ish years or so. And the treatment of transgender young people has also been around for decades. So just to give you some context, I did my medical school training in 2000. And so that was 24 years ago, which is a long time ago. And when I was doing training, I learned about transgender health and transgender medicine for young people, not during my medical school curriculum, but in working with some folks in community clinics, caring for trans youth, particularly at youth drop-in centers and things like that. So The medicine, the research has been around for decades. The medications that we use to care for the small percentage of young people who seek those medications have also been around for decades. So the medication that people usually refer to as puberty blockers or puberty suppressing medication, that's a medication that we use in the field of pediatric endocrinology to suppress puberty when it happens too early for kids, a term we call precocious puberty. We've been using that medication for 40 to 50 years. We have numerous studies on the safety and efficacy of that medication. And, within the last 20 to 30 years have been using that exact same medication for transgender young people. Hormones like estrogen and testosterone have also been used not just in adult transgender medicine, but again, in pediatric endocrinology and pediatric gynecology for young people who are missing some of those hormones and need treatment with those hormones because their own bodies don't make enough. And so we have really good evidence and studies both on the safety and efficacy of the medications, but then more importantly on the impact of having access to those medications on the health and well-being of transgender and gender diverse young people. And every year we have many more studies that reinforce the point that when transgender young people can access not only support and resources and care and parental and community support, but also when they need it, medications that support their identity and their puberty that aligns with who they are, they do better. They have better mental health outcomes. They're more successful. They're more self-assured. They basically just get to be kids and young people, like all other kids and young people. So they still go through, all the heartache and heartbreak that all kids do, but not at disproportionately worse or higher rates with more anxiety or more depression. They do just as well as their peers and better than those who don't have access to care.
A number of years ago, I was actually working with a community organization. It was Rainbow Health Initiative a number of years ago, doing LGBTQ health education work, right? So I was taking the data, the community data, and then going out to clinics and all sorts of different places, medical academic degree programs, and providing education based off of that data. And a lot of times it was through the continuing education units that we were offering that. And I heard a number of different stories of people saying, why wasn't this included in my degree program if this has been around forever? And also saying, why do we have to rely on the CEUs to get this information? Can you walk us collectively through? This has been around for decades, the knowledge of this, the research around this. Walk us through why it wasn't included as actual credit-bearing courses in these medical degree programs.
Yeah, I mean, the answer lies essentially in health disparities. The fact that when marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community, the transgender community, various communities of color also experience this as well. Marginalized communities experience health disparities, and often those disparities are in part because we aren't adequately trained to care for them. So I was really surprised when I went to medical school in the 2000s that I wasn't learning anything about LGBTQ populations really at all in my medical school curriculum. Now, that has certainly changed. I'm happy to say 24 years later, there is more incorporated into curriculum. So this will change over the next decade as more and more people get educated. But it just was not a part of the care and curriculum, even though it was certainly a part of medical care at the time. I would even include women in that. There's basic reproductive healthcare information that is just not routinely part of medical training. You have to seek it out in a specialized way. So I think we have a long way to go in some of the broader structures around how we do education and training. The one thing I'll add, because I do have sort of a background in education and expertise in that area, is that when states ban care, they're also banning opportunities for learning. So in all the states that have banned care for trans youth, it means that any, training pediatricians in those states, residents, medical students who may go on to provide this care in their practice are not able to train in it. So any and all strides we've made to incorporate training in trans healthcare, we're kind of rolling that back now by instituting these bans.
And there have been, first of all, you keep saying that 2000 was 24 years ago, and
I know.
That's causing me to panic.
I know. I know. 24 years ago in my mind
age.
is still like the 70s, but yes.
I hear
Yeah.
2000 in my mind. I'm like, that was just a couple years ago. Oh my gosh. But there were also, I mean, you said there were standards internationally. The Institute
Mhm,
of Medicine, also, I believe it was in 2011, correct? If I'm
mhm.
remembering that, they came out with their standards. I know that locally here in the state of Minnesota, I believe you were part of that grant
Yeah.
with the Bush Foundation that created a standards of care for Minnesota itself.
Mhm.
So the industry has, the industry, but I kept saying the word, the fields of healthcare have been creating these standards for a very long time.
Yes.
Okay. See, already helping me to clarify and think more clearly about this issue. I hope, folks, you're feeling that same way as well, because we want you to be able to take this back to your tables, your Thanksgiving tables, your kitchen tables, wherever, and share actual verifiable facts about this issue. My guest is Dr. Kade Goepferd, who is the Chief Education Officer and Medical Director of the Gender Health Program at Children's Minnesota. We are going to fit in another break here. Be sure to connect with our sponsors and advertisers who make not only this program possible, but help us bring progressive news and radio to the state of Minnesota. When you connect with them, tell them you heard about them on The Gailey Show on AM 950 Radio. See you on the flip side of this break. And you're back with us here at The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. With me here is Dr. Kade Goepferd for our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episodes, where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. Today, we're talking about healthcare for trans, genderqueer, and non-binary youth. Dr. Goepferd, walk me through, we sort of touched on this earlier in the episode, walk me through the difference between gender exploration and identity expression, and how that might differ from children that are more clearly experiencing, like, hey, maybe this is an area we want to actually start providing care through the gender clinic at Children's Minnesota. Can you walk us through, like, what kids would be saying, what would they be doing, what would they be expressing in
Yeah.
these situations?
Yeah. I think the first thing to sort of keep in mind is the age of the young person. So,
Mhm.
Developmentally, younger kids will absolutely go through periods where they're trying out what they like. They're trying out, different clothes, different hairstyles. They, from a very young age, 2 to 4 years old in particular, kids are just drawn to what they like, which, may be a sparkly princess dress, maybe, playing a sport outside, might be having short hair, long hair, painting their fingernails, not painting their fingernails. And none of that is much for us to get worked up about. And I think sometimes families, even with very good intentions, will see their young person starting to sort of explore things that they are perceiving aren't sort of part of what they would expect. So maybe a boy who's wanting to wear princess dresses, or a girl who wants a really short haircut. And then they start to maybe form opinions about what if their child is transgender. And I think that's not a bad thought to have, but I also think we can just kind of slow it down a little bit and give the young person some time to sort of navigate. So there's a real difference between wanting to, explore expression or sort of things that are on the outside of you versus telling in no, unclear terms to an adult, I am a boy or I am a girl, or, if I don't wear this dress, how are people going to know I'm a girl versus, I like wearing dresses that are sparkly. Like, those are very different sort of statements. As kids get older, so into sort of late elementary, and then into adolescence, they do have a much better sense of who they are and their identity. So when kids at those older ages are, again, not just exploring different ways to dress and show up in terms of their expression, but they're asking questions and having conversations potentially about using different pronouns, or wanting to, thinking that they might be gender expansive in some way, or using some words around that. I think it's important to listen to those conversations, again, listening, loving, being supportive, asking good questions. That's what we do as parents. I'm a parent of 3 kids. That's what I try to do with them all the time. If it's really persisting, and particularly if the young person is experiencing some distress about it, that would be a good time to call either your pediatrician or whoever is providing care for your child, and or our gender health program, and say, I think we want to have a conversation. We want to learn more. We want to support our young person. This has been going on for a while, and we want to make sure that they have what they need.
Walk me through the idea of, the concept of gender dysphoria, the diagnosis, and because there is a lot of harm and misinformation and lies around being trans or non-binary, gender non-conforming, or gay, lesbian, bisexual, ace is a mental illness.
Yeah.
And you need to treat that, and then the rest of it will sort itself out. And I think they point to things like gender dysphoria as a diagnosis and say, well, see, there you go. Walk us through what that diagnosis is, if it might be, part of the care or not, and what happens afterwards.
Yeah. Medical diagnoses can be pretty tricky. We have to provide treatment for something, we have to have a condition that exists. So I'm going to give you pregnancy as a good example. There's nothing wrong with you if you're pregnant. You just happen to have the condition of pregnancy. So we need to be able to identify that, bill under that, treat you for that condition. But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. And so there are certainly medical diagnoses, and, being transgender or having a diagnosis of gender dysphoria are one of those, where we're describing something because there's an opportunity to provide some treatment. It is well known that conversion therapy, it does not work and is in fact very harmful. We banned it in the state of Minnesota in 2023. It's, decried by every major medical and mental health associations. So you can't change someone from being queer, from being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. You can't change someone's gender identity. So we know that that doesn't work. What we do know is that to be LGBTQ in this society, and particularly right now in this moment in history, is to experience incredible amounts of stigma and discrimination. And that causes a lot of distress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, and in some cases, suicidality. So absolutely, we need to provide support around those things, but it's not about fixing the underlying identity. And so when someone is expressing an identity that is different than what society or the people in their lives, expect, and it has to do with their gender, we refer to that person as transgender, and then medically we would treat them under the condition or the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. But we're not saying there's something wrong with that person. It's just a way for us to provide them treatment and support.
So thank you for that. I think that's really important for folks to hear that, to unpack what that means and what's really happening there. So when a child comes to the clinic at Children's Minnesota, what does that process look like? Like what's happening in that moment for both the child and the parents and the family?
Yeah. I mean, first, let's just be clear, no young people are coming alone. So we kind of went through that in your rapid fire questions, but you kind of threw in parents there. So I would reframe that as when parents bring their young person, their child, their teenager to the clinic, a few things happen. So first, they call and they get an appointment. We unfortunately have a waiting list, so they'll be waiting for a little while to come in. And then when they come, they'll have 2 appointments. They'll have an appointment with one of our mental health professionals, either a child psychologist or a gender health program therapist. And then they'll have an appointment with one of our physicians in the program. And the reason behind the mental health appointment is that we are treating young people who are in different phases of development. And as we mentioned, are also experiencing high rates of stigma and discrimination. And they're all coming to us from different family systems with different levels of support. So part of what we need to assess up front is, what's happening in the family, what's happening at school, how much distress is the child experiencing, do they have the right supports in place, kind of where are they at developmentally, how are they understanding what's going on with them. And then when they come to meet with one of us as a physician, we're really kind of focusing on what the family thinks they need. So why are they there? What questions do they need answered? What supports do they need? And depending on the age of the child, we may then start talking about options for medications. But most of what we do is talking to families, talking to young people, and getting them the supports that they need to be successful and thrive in their families, in school, and in their communities.
What does the ongoing care look like?
Yeah.
I want to raise that within the question of another lie that we hear, which is that everybody who begins in gender affirmation ultimately hates it and regrets the decision, which is like there's zero data, but apparently data just doesn't matter anymore. But for the folks who care and are listening to this, or folks who are asking that question of, well, what is that? The data is literally like less than 1% of people experience any type of regret, right? So let's just put that fact out there. Walk us through then, what does care look like over the rest of their youthhood, their childhood, their adolescence?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for pointing that out. So, first of all, regret or discontinuation of care is extraordinarily low and rare. And the vast majority of young people who will seek care at a gender health program will go on to both continue that care and be highly satisfied with their care. There's this sort of dangerous overstory that's been written that kind of started with the myth about, well, kids are just going to school and then they're coming home having surgeries in different genders, which we all know that's ridiculous, but it puts a seed in our head that something scary and dangerous is happening with young people and with gender identity. And the truth is that nothing scary and dangerous is happening at all. So there's lots of myths out there about young children, for example. No young child is receiving any medical treatment of any kind when it comes to their medical care. The very first time that we would intervene in a medical sense for, again, the relatively small percentage of young people who seek that would be at puberty. So we're really talking middle school age here. And any interventions that we would offer for that age group would be reversible, would be something that parents are deciding on behalf of their child. So parents are very much involved in this care, and is something that we could stop and start at any time should things shift for that young person. So that would be something like puberty suppression, stopping menstrual period, potentially helping with voice therapy or voice regulation, shapewear to help them sort of shape what their physical body looks like, and other treatments that then people may seek as they get older, so more into the high school age, middle to late adolescence, would be hormones like estrogen or testosterone to help them go through a puberty or have physical changes that align with their identity. And there's even myths out there about those medications, that they're sterilizing young people, that they are causing, permanent things that then, young people go on to regret, which we know isn't true. But even the effects of the medications themselves, they're partially reversible. There are many changes that are actually reversible with these medications, and then some that are not. And all of that has gone through very clearly with the young person and their parents. And again, involves our mental health personnel to sort of help determine how much someone understands. And then surgery is just not a part of our care. So we don't offer surgical care in our clinic. Surgical care is first very small percentage of what is even offered within the field of transgender medicine. So lawmakers like to talk about surgery, but many transgender people never have surgery. So even as adults, and the numbers of transgender young people who have surgery are in the hundreds across the country, which when you look at, so say chest surgeries, teenagers who are having chest surgeries, either augmenting their breasts or reducing their breasts, or folks who are assigned male at birth that have gynecomastia or breast tissue that they then have removed, those numbers are well into the thousands. So, 200 to 300-fold more young people having surgeries or cosmetic surgeries that are not transgender than who are. So really, much of this sort of fear mongering and this dangerous overstory about transgender medicine and young transgender people is trying to propose a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. There is no problem. There's no high regret rates. There's no bad outcomes. There's no, dangerous things happening to children without parents knowing. That's all been created so that they can move forward with legislation that will actively harm and restrict transgender and gender diverse young people. So, I was saying to you at the break, and I often say to people, if I could just have people kind of on my shoulder in clinic, sort of watching the interactions we have with families and the way that we talk with families and young people, I think a lot of this would go away. This is healthcare, just like all other healthcare, provided to a very stigmatized part of our population, and now the care itself is becoming stigmatized as well.
Dr. Goepferd, thank you so much for your time today. This has been illuminating for me, and I hope for our listeners as well on this weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly. You're definitely helping all of us think more clearly about this issue and the care that we're providing. Folks, you can go to childrensmn.org to learn more about the Gender Care Clinic and about Dr. Goepferd and their work. And I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Goepferd, for joining us here on The Gailey Show.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to help people think more clearly about this, so I appreciate it.
We may have you back, don't to talk about that. But for folks, we're going to take one final break here, and then I'm going to, afterwards, continue our series, Queer in the Cosmos. We're going to finish up last week and then start light year number 2. That'll make so much more sense when you tune in after the break. So lots to get to still here on The Gailey Show on AM 950, KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm your host, JP Debergosian. Last Thursday, I started a series that I'm going to end our Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episodes with that I'm calling A Queer in the Cosmos, which is my own personal journey exploring the cosmos and what it is, the implications of that, what it is doing in changing my own sort of thoughts and feelings and outlook in the world. So it is a personal series, but I think that it will be something that resonates with you and the folks at home, if you will. So last week I read too slowly and didn't get to finish my episode, but my essay rather from last week. It's that essay is called Light Year 1. So I'm going to finish that up, and then we'll begin my second essay, which is Light Year 2. So I was talking about 2 books that I had read. One was, the first was Marjolein van Heemstra's memoir, In Light Years, There's No Hurry, Cosmic Perspectives on Everyday Life. I mean, come on, how perfect is that for this particular series of Queer in the Cosmos? The other was What's Gotten Into You, The Story of Your Body's Atoms from the Big Bang Through Last Night's Dinner. Again, a book exactly what I have needed. I'll share more about these books over the coming weeks, but 2 learnings immediately stood out to me. The first was the overview effect. This was a phenomenon experienced by astronauts. It is a cognitive realignment or awakening they experienced while in space and observing the Earth. They shared experiencing a state of awe, a new appreciation of the utterly unique beauty of the Earth, even feeling overwhelming emotions for the Earth as a whole. They mentioned in their interviews that as scientists, they tried to evaluate this phenomenon when they got into space. And they said, well, first they were looking for their own home cities, then their own home states, and then their countries, but that eventually these lines fell away for them and they saw the Earth in its entirety, and their thinking about issues changed. They had a different perspective on how to relate to other humans and the life around them. I'm oversimplifying here. Yes, there's a great documentary about it. You can watch it on YouTube. It's from December 2012 called The Overview Effect. The other learning that still breaks my brain is our bodies are 10% hydrogen. And every hydrogen atom in our bodies got started when something called quarks and gluons created protons. And anyhow, this happened less than a second after the Big Bang. The hydrogen in our bodies then is from the Big Bang itself 13.8 billion years ago. It traveled out and formed the stars. The atoms in my body and your body are billions of years old. It gives it a completely different take on the idea of past lives. Billions of minuscule atoms in our bodies were created in the Big Bang and then were churning around in stars and then exploding out into the universe. And somehow it found its way into making you over the 4.5 billion years the Earth has been around. Some of you probably know this. I'm coming to it later in my life. but it's provided a solace to know the remarkably deep connection that I have, that we all have, to our universe. Light year 2. Hydrogen. You can't see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it. That's odd to me, given it's the most important element in the universe. Sure, we need to breathe oxygen, and our bodies need nitrogen and iron and a whole bunch of other elements, but it's not possible, none of it, without hydrogen. When I was growing up, a queer kid in a world devoid of queerness, I had the fantasy, so many of us have, I was switched at birth, and my real family was out there with the wrong kid. I would map out my family trees and think I'm supposed to be part of this, but in reality, I was just waiting for a man in a black suit to show up to inform everyone there had been a horrible mistake. Family trees for a child are just a way of thinking about DNA without realizing you're thinking about DNA, which is why I was thrilled as an adult when Ancestry DNA came out. Finally, I thought, maybe I'll get some insights here, either on my father's side or my mother's side. I'll finally find the queer branch of the family. No such luck. DNA showed me where I should have been living if the genocide hadn't happened. It's funny to think about how you should never have been born on a particular continent or in a particular hemisphere. Looking at that map, the only physical, tangible connection I had was my finger resting on the screen, pointing to the region Ancestry DNA claims my family's DNA comes from. With DNA, history also stops. On my American side, we can go back hundreds of years because there are enough family members alive and there are lots of paper records to create a trail back to England and Scotland and Ireland, but not on the Armenian side. History basically stops because of the genocide. No paper records, not enough folks to really create an accurate genetic history. When I started this journey into the cosmos, I realized what every science student in high school realizes: DNA isn't the building block of life. Well, I mean, yes, it is the building block of life, but it's made of elements. It can be subdivided. I wasn't great at science and math growing up, so if you're listening to this thinking, he's just finding this out, I learned all this in the 7th grade. Well, I was doing different things than you in 7th grade. I was having an existential crisis, subconsciously using the arts to manage my emotions. Chemistry, geology, algebra were classes to survive, not to learn from. So here I am now, at my age, learning what DNA is made of, realizing that trying to find your place in the world goes beyond your DNA. And when you start looking at what makes up your DNA, you're no longer talking about finding your place in the world, but in the cosmos. We come back to, then, hydrogen. And the stupid thing is, hydrogen isn't even complicated. It's the simplest element of them all. Just one proton, one electron, and yet all of it, all the hydrogen, goes all the way back to the Big Bang. It was the first element, and it makes up 90% of the matter in the universe. About 10% of your body is hydrogen. If you weigh 150 pounds, you could think of 10% of your body as like the shoulders on up, with your head weighing about 10 to 11 pounds. So add a bit more to that. That was created almost 14 billion years ago. And you're just walking around with it, using it to drink your chai tea, to watch the Great British Bake Off, using it to shake your fist at the person driving like a maniac on Interstate 35. All that hydrogen was just floating around after the Big Bang, and then started to coalesce, more and more of it compacting and compacting until becoming so heavy, the gravity of it pulled in more and more hydrogen and space dust until the pressure set off nuclear fusion and exploded into a star. And that star burned for billions of years. And in the process, the larger stars ultimately created iron and calcium and other heavier elements. And then the star exploded, and all those elements shot through space. And that hydrogen might have ended up getting sucked into another star and repeating the process. Fast forward a few billion years, and that hydrogen finds itself on Earth, and we end up ingesting it as water, or a plant drinks up that water, and then we eat that plant, and then our bodies take that glucose and break it down into carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. I'm going to pause there. We'll pick this up again next week, and queer and cosmos, rather. We'll be back here tomorrow, 2 p.m. We've got some special guests to talk to on culture and entertainment. Be well, everybody. See you tomorrow, 2 p.m. Up next, The Matt McNeil Show.